The blizzard struck without mercy on the morning Rebecca Thornton realized her husband wasn't coming back. She stood at the cabin window, one hand pressed against the frosted glass, the other cradling the swell of her belly where their child grew beneath her worn woolen dress. Snow whipped across the clearing with such fury that she couldn't make out the fence posts Otis had set just 20 yards from their door. The wind howled through every chink in their hastily built walls like the voices of the damned, carrying with it the bitter promise that this storm meant to stay until it had taken everything she held dear. He'd been gone 3 days now, riding toward Millfield to settle accounts with the grain merchant who'd been pressing them for payment since harvest. 3 days that stretched into an eternity of wind, battering their small cabin, and temperatures that made the water bucket freeze solid even when placed near the hearth. Rebecca pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to convince herself that Otis had simply taken shelter in town, waiting for the storm to pass like any sensible man would do. The grain merchant had a wife, she reminded herself, a woman who wouldn't turn away a traveler caught in such weather. But the knot in her stomach told a different story, growing tighter with each hour that passed without the sound of his horse's hooves crunching through snow, or his voice calling her name through the storm. Otis Thornton had never been a man to let weather keep him from his word, and he'd promised to return by nightfall the day he left. That promise lay broken now, scattered like the snow that drifted against their door in banks that reached nearly to the window ledge. The baby kicked hard beneath her ribs, as if sensing her distress through the taut drum of her belly. 7 months along, she figured, though without proper accounting she couldn't be certain. Out here on the frontier, a woman learned to reckon time by the seasons and the shape of her changing body rather than calendar pages torn from almanacs. The child moved again, strong and insistent, demanding attention she wasn't sure she could give if Otis didn't return soon. Her hands moved instinctively to the spot where tiny limbs pressed against her skin, and she whispered a prayer that seemed to disappear into the cabin's cold air. Rebecca pressed her ear to the thick oak door, listening past the storm's roar for any sound that might herald her husband's return. Nothing came but the relentless wind and the creaking of their cabin as it strained against nature's assault, timbers groaning like old bones under the weight of accumulating snow. She'd been foolish to hope otherwise. If Otis were close enough to reach home, he'd have been here by now, calling out reassurances as he led his horse to shelter in their small barn. The fire in their stone hearth had burned low, orange flames dancing weakly around the last split log Otis had placed there before departing. She knew she'd need to venture out to the woodpile before long, though the thought of opening their door to that howling wilderness made her stomach clench with fear. Otis had stacked enough split logs to last a week, but that was before this storm decided to settle over their homestead like a living thing determined to squeeze the warmth from everything it touched. She counted the remaining pieces stacked beside the fireplace, calculating carefully. Maybe enough for 2 more days if she was careful, 3 if she let the fire die to coals during the darkest hours and huddled beneath every quilt they owned. Moving slowly, favoring her aching back, she lowered herself into the rocking chair Otis had crafted from oak salvaged from a lightning-struck tree. The chair had been his wedding gift to her, carved with patient hands during their first winter when blizzards had kept him indoors for days at a time. Each smooth curve spoke of his love, every joint fitted with the precision of a man who understood that frontier life demanded excellence in even the smallest details. Her back ached something fierce these days, and her feet had swollen until her boots barely fit over stockings grown thin from constant wear. The baby seemed to have taken up residence just beneath her lungs, making every breath a conscious effort that reminded her of the burden she carried both within and without. She'd need help soon, the kind of help that came from other women who'd walked this treacherous path before her, women who knew the secrets of bringing life safely into an unforgiving world. but the nearest neighbor lived 5 miles east through country that had grown treacherous even before the storm arrived. Mrs. Elizabeth Patterson had her own troubles with a new baby barely 3 months old and a husband who drank more than he farmed, spending his days in town while she struggled to maintain their failing homestead. Even under the best circumstances, reaching the Patterson place would require a full day's hard travel through snow that might be knee-deep or deeper depending on how the wind had shaped the drifts. The wind shifted direction, rattling the single window in its frame with renewed violence. Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to remember the sound of Otis's voice, the way he'd sing old hymns while working in their small garden during the brief summer months, how he'd place his calloused hand on her belly each night and whisper promises to their unborn child about the good life they'd build together on this harsh frontier. He'd spoken of adding rooms to the cabin come spring, of clearing more land for crops, of maybe getting a milk cow and some chickens to make their homestead feel more like the farms they'd known back in Missouri. All those plans felt fragile now, like soap bubbles that might pop if she examined them too closely or dared to hope too much. She'd married Otis Thornton 3 years ago in her father's parlor back in Independence, with her mother crying into her best handkerchief and her father wondering aloud if she was making a mistake following a man west into territory that remained more wilderness than civilization. The preacher had spoken of love and duty while autumn wind rattled the windows of her childhood home, and Rebecca had felt so certain then that she was choosing the right path. Otis had painted pictures with his words of the life they'd make together, the family they'd raise, the legacy they'd leave on land that would truly belong to them, rather than some landlord who'd never worked a day in the soil he claimed to own. The reality had proven harsher than his dreams, beautiful as they'd been in the telling. Their first winter had nearly killed them both when Otis took sick with pneumonia, and she'd had to tend him while learning to manage their few cattle and stretch their meager supplies until spring. She'd fed him broth made from bones and wild onions, sat up through fever-racked nights listening to his labored breathing and wondering if she'd be left to face the wilderness alone. The second year brought a drought that withered their crops and forced them to trade away Otis's grandfather's silver pocket watch for seed grain, a transaction that had broken his heart though he'd tried to hide his grief from her. This third year had started with such promise, good rains that turned their small garden into something approaching abundance, healthy crops that might actually turn a profit, and the news that they'd have a child to carry on their name and justify all the hardships they'd endured. Now she sat alone in a cabin that felt more like a trap than a home, listening to wind that sounded like the voices of the damned, and wondering if she'd been a fool to follow her husband into this unforgiving country. The baby kicked again, harder this time, a sharp jab that made her gasp and press both hands to her belly. The child was strong, she could feel that much, but strength alone might not be enough to survive what was coming. "Easy there, little one," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm's constant roar. "Your daddy's coming home. He has to come home. He promised." But even as she spoke the words, she found herself planning for the possibility that Otis might not return, that she'd been right to worry and wrong to hope. If the storm broke tomorrow, she could try to make it to the Patterson place on foot, following the creek bed that served as a natural pathway between their properties. It would be a hard journey in her condition, harder still with snow that might reach her waist in places, but she'd walked farther when they'd first arrived and were scouting locations for their homestead. If the snow proved too deep or the cold too bitter, she'd have to wait and hope someone came looking for them. The grain merchant knew Otis had been coming to settle accounts. Surely when he failed to appear, questions would be asked. The thought of giving birth alone in this cabin made her hands shake with more than cold. She'd attended 2 births back home in Missouri, helping her mother tend to neighbor women in their hour of need, but she'd never imagined facing such a trial without experienced hands to guide her through the ordeal. Women died in childbirth under the best of circumstances, with doctors and midwives and proper preparations. Out here, with winter raging and no help in sight, the odds seemed stacked against both her and the child she carried. She tried to remember everything her mother had taught her about birthing babies, but the knowledge felt inadequate against the enormity of what might be required. She tried to push such dark thoughts aside, focusing instead on practical matters that demanded immediate attention. Their stores included enough cornmeal and salt pork to last 2 weeks if she was careful with portions, maybe 3 if she added water to stretch the cornmeal into a thin porridge that would fill her belly if not satisfy her hunger. The root cellar held potatoes, carrots, and apples that would keep if the cold didn't reach them through the packed earth walls Otis had reinforced with stones gathered from the creek bed. She had herbs for tea, mint and chamomile she'd dried herself during the brief autumn months, and a bit of honey Otis had traded for in town during his last successful trip to market. It wasn't much, certainly not enough to see her through winter if she remained alone, but she'd seen families survive on less during the hardest times. The cabin shuddered as another fierce gust struck its walls, and Rebecca could hear something loose banging against the exterior. Perhaps a shutter or a piece of roof tin that had worked free under the storm's assault. She rose from the rocking chair, moving to check the door's wooden bar. Otis had built their home with careful attention to security, knowing that frontier life attracted both desperate men and dangerous animals driven to bold actions by hunger and cold. The thick oak door fitted snug in its frame, and iron hinges held it firm against any who might try to force their way inside. Still, she felt vulnerable here alone, carrying a child and unable to move with her usual quickness should trouble arise. Outside, something crashed in the wind, definitely a tree branch this time, by the sound of it, probably from the old elm that stood near their small barn. Rebecca peered through the window, but could see nothing beyond the wall of white that surrounded their homestead like a living thing intent on swallowing every familiar landmark. She'd need to survey the damage once the storm passed, assuming she lived to see that day and could manage such work in her condition. The thought came unbidden and unwelcome, but she couldn't shake it entirely. Women in her situation had died from less severe circumstances than this. Moving carefully to their small pantry, little more than shelves Otis had built into the cabin's corner, she took inventory of their supplies more thoroughly than she'd done since he left. The news wasn't encouraging. Even with careful rationing, she'd run short of food before the month ended. The salt pork would last longest, but she'd need other provisions to maintain her strength and the baby's health. Without careful planning, she might face the choice between starving slowly and venturing out into dangerous conditions to seek help from neighbors who might not be able to provide it. The baby moved restlessly, as if picking up on her mother's anxiety through some mysterious connection that bound them together. Rebecca placed both hands on her belly and began to hum an old lullaby her own mother had sung, a melody that spoke of safety and love and all the things she desperately wanted to provide for this child. Her voice sounded small and lost in the cabin's confines, barely audible over the wind's constant howl, but she continued anyway because the alternative was to surrender to despair. She thought of her mother's letters, the last one received just before the first serious snow. Mother had begged her to come home for the birth, offering to pay for passage back to Missouri, where proper medical care and family support awaited any woman foolish enough to have married a frontier dreamer. Rebecca had written back declining the offer, explaining that her place was beside her husband on the land they'd claimed together, that their child should be born on soil they could call their own rather than in someone else's parlor. Now that decision seemed as foolish as it was proud, another example of the romantic notions that had led her so far from safety and sense. The fire crackled lower, demanding attention she could no longer postpone. Rebecca added one of their precious logs, watching the flames lick higher as fresh wood caught and released the stored warmth of summer sun. The heat felt good against her face, and she lingered there longer than she should have, knowing she needed to conserve fuel but unable to resist the comfort it offered. Otis had always taken care of the heavy work, splitting wood, hauling water from the creek, maintaining their small barn and the livestock pen where their few cattle sheltered. Rebecca could manage these tasks when necessary, had done so during his brief absences, but pregnancy had made even simple chores exhausting affairs that left her breathless and aching. If he didn't return soon, she'd be forced to venture outside regardless of the weather, and the thought of struggling through snowdrifts while carrying their child filled her with dread. The woodpile lay only 30 yards from their door, but 30 yards might as well be 30 miles in conditions like these. She'd heard stories of men who'd frozen to death between their house and barn, caught in blizzards so fierce they couldn't find their way back to safety. The thought of her child being born to a mother who'd died of exposure just steps from shelter was almost too terrible to contemplate. She tried to picture Otis somewhere warm and safe, perhaps sharing a meal with the grain merchant's family while they all waited for the storm to pass. Samuel Morrison was a decent man, despite his insistence on prompt payment, and his wife Martha had always been kind during Rebecca's few visits to town. It was a comforting image, one that let her believe his absence came from wisdom rather than misfortune, but deep in her heart she feared something darker had befallen him. The frontier held too many dangers for a man traveling alone: bandits who preyed on isolated travelers, animals driven desperate by hunger, weather that could turn deadly without warning. Winter made even familiar paths treacherous, and Otis had been carrying money, enough to settle their debt and perhaps purchase supplies for the coming months. The wind seemed to be picking up strength as evening approached, rattling every loose board and making the entire cabin groan under the assault. Rebecca lit their precious oil lamp, its small flame pushing back shadows that had grown longer as what little daylight managed to penetrate the storm began to fade. The golden light made their modest home feel smaller but somehow more secure, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of winter fury that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. She settled back into the rocking chair with her mending basket, trying to keep her hands busy while her mind raced through possibilities and plans that grew more desperate with each consideration. The baby's christening gown lay half-finished among her sewing supplies, delicate white cotton that seemed impossibly fragile in this harsh environment. She'd been embroidering tiny flowers along the collar during the long autumn evenings, work that required good light and steady hands to create something beautiful enough for such an important occasion. Both were becoming harder to maintain as pregnancy progressed and their circumstances grew more desperate with each passing hour. The baby kicked again, a movement that might have brought joy under different circumstances but now felt like a reminder of her enormous responsibility. This child deserved better than to be born in a freezing cabin with no one but its frightened mother to welcome it into the world. It deserved the security Otis had promised, the loving home they'd planned to build together, the future they'd dreamed of during those long winter nights when anything seemed possible if they just worked hard enough and held on to hope. Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to pray, searching for words that might reach through the storm to whatever divine presence watched over lost souls in desperate circumstances. But the phrases seemed to freeze before they could form properly, falling short of the mark like arrows shot into a fierce wind. She'd been raised to believe that God watched over his children, that faith could move mountains and survive any trial if it burned bright enough in a believer's heart. But sitting alone in this storm, feeling utterly abandoned by both her husband and her God, such beliefs felt as distant as the warmth of summer or the safety of her childhood home. The wind howled louder, as if mocking her distress and proclaiming its dominance over human hopes and fears. Rebecca pulled her shawl closer and continued rocking, each motion a small defiance against the forces that threatened to overwhelm her. She would survive this night and the ones that followed. She would find a way to bring this child safely into the world. She would endure whatever trials awaited, because the alternative was unthinkable and her child deserved a mother who refused to surrender to despair. Outside, the storm raged on with no sign of breaking, and Rebecca Thornton faced the longest night of her life wondering if she'd see another dawn, and whether her husband would ever come home to find what remained of the family he'd left behind in this wilderness cabin that had become both shelter and prison. 6 months later, the spring thaw had transformed the frontier landscape into something Rebecca barely recognized. Where snow had once buried every familiar landmark beneath its merciless white shroud, now wildflowers dotted the meadows in patches of yellow and purple that seemed to mock the memory of those desperate winter days. She stood in the doorway of what folks in Millfield had taken to calling the Patterson-Thornton place, watching her adopted daughter Sally chase chickens around the yard, while baby James gurgled contentedly in the wooden cradle Otis had never seen completed. The child she'd carried through that terrible blizzard had arrived on a February morning when the storm finally broke, delivered with the help of Elizabeth Patterson and old Doc Henley, who'd ridden through knee-deep snow after Mrs. Patterson had managed to reach town with news of Rebecca's situation. James Otis Thornton had entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed to announce his intention to thrive despite the circumstances of his birth, and Rebecca had wept with relief and grief in equal measure. Relief that he'd survived, grief that his father wasn't there to hold him. But that had been before Samuel Morrison arrived with news that changed everything Rebecca thought she knew about her husband's disappearance. The grain merchant had come calling 3 weeks after the birth, his face grave with the weight of secrets he could no longer bear to carry. Otis hadn't died in the storm, Morrison revealed. He'd made it to town safely, settled his accounts as promised, and then disappeared into the night with nearly $200 that belonged to the merchant's business, money intended for spring seed purchases that would now have to come from Morrison's own pocket. The revelation had hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her husband hadn't perished in the blizzard as she'd feared and mourned. He'd abandoned her deliberately, choosing theft and flight over the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage. Morrison had been kind in his delivery of the news, even offering to forget the debt in consideration of her circumstances, but Rebecca had insisted on working to repay every cent. Her pride wouldn't allow her to accept charity built on her husband's criminal actions. Elizabeth Patterson had taken Rebecca and the baby into her own struggling household without hesitation, creating space where none existed and sharing resources that were already stretched thin. The arrangement should have been temporary, just until Rebecca could get back on her feet, but as weeks turned to months, it became clear that 2 women working together could accomplish what neither could manage alone. Elizabeth's husband had finally drunk himself to death in March, and rather than leaving his widow destitute, his demise had created an opportunity for both women to build something better from the wreckage of their former lives. Now Rebecca tended the garden that fed both families while Elizabeth managed their small but growing flock of chickens and the milk cow they'd purchased together with money Rebecca earned, taking in washing and mending for the bachelor farmers scattered throughout the territory. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a good life nonetheless, built on honest work and mutual support rather than the romantic notions that had once seemed so important. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Rebecca's attention to the road that wound past their property toward town. A lone rider approached at a steady pace, his horse kicking up small clouds of dust from the dry earth. As he drew closer, Rebecca felt her stomach tighten with recognition. The set of the man's shoulders, the way he sat his saddle, it was Otis, returned like some ghost from a past she'd worked so hard to leave behind. Elizabeth emerged from the chicken coop with eggs gathered in her apron, took one look at Rebecca's face, and immediately understood the situation. "Sally," she called to the little girl, "come help me in the kitchen. We need to start supper." The child, now 5 years old and legally adopted into Rebecca's care through papers filed with the territorial court, obeyed without question. She'd learned during her short life to read the subtle signs that indicated when adult conversations required privacy. Elizabeth had found Sally hiding in their barn during the worst of the winter storms, a runaway from circumstances no child should have to endure, and both women had agreed without discussion that she belonged with them now. Otis dismounted at the edge of the yard, tying his horse to the fence post with movements that seemed careful and deliberate. He looked older than his 32 years, his face weathered by months of hard travel and harder living. His clothes were good quality but worn, the kind a man might acquire through gambling winnings or questionable dealings. He'd grown a beard that couldn't quite hide the lines worry and guilt had carved around his eyes. "Rebecca," he said, removing his hat as he approached. His voice carried the same gentle cadence she remembered, but something fundamental had changed in its tone. "You look well. Motherhood suits you." She remained in the doorway, neither welcoming nor forbidding his approach. "What do you want, Otis?" "I've come to make things right. To explain what happened, why I had to leave." He gestured toward the cradle where James slept peacefully in the afternoon sun. "To meet my son and ask if there's still a place for me in your life." Rebecca felt anger rise in her chest like bile, hot and bitter after months of careful control. "Your son? You forfeited any claim to that title when you stole Morrison's money and left us to starve." Otis flinched as if she'd struck him. "I didn't steal nothing that wasn't already owed to me. Morrison's been cheating farmers for years, taking grain at below market prices and selling it for double in the eastern cities. I just collected what he owed every man who'd been foolish enough to trust his honest face." "And where's that money now?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Gone," Otis admitted, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Lost most of it to a card sharp in Denver, spent the rest trying to win it back. I know how that sounds, but I was desperate to return with enough to make up for what I'd done, to provide for you and our child the way a man should." Rebecca stepped out of the doorway, moving to stand beside the cradle where her son slept. James had grown into a sturdy baby with his father's dark hair and what everyone said were his mother's stubborn chin. He deserved better than a father who'd chosen gambling over responsibility, romance over reality. "You had 6 months to send word," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "6 months while I wondered if you were dead, or if I'd been fool enough to marry a man who'd abandon his family when things got difficult. I grieved for you, Otis. I mourned the husband I thought had died in that storm, and I named our son after the memory of a man I believed had loved us enough to fight his way home." Otis moved closer, his expression desperate with the need to make her understand. "I tried to come back sooner. Soon as I realized what a mistake I'd made, soon as the money was gone and I had to face what I'd done. But I couldn't return empty-handed, couldn't ask you to forgive me without offering something to make up for the pain I'd caused." "So what changed?" Rebecca asked. "What brought you back now with nothing but excuses and regret?" Otis looked around the property, taking in the evidence of the life she'd built without him. The garden flourished under her care, the fence posts stood straight and secure, fresh paint gleamed on the barn's weathered boards. 2 women working together had accomplished more in 6 months than he'd managed in 3 years of trying to farm alone. "I heard things in town," he said finally. "About how you'd been getting by, about the arrangement you'd made with Mrs. Patterson. Some folks are saying it ain't proper, 2 women raising children together without men to guide them. There's talk of getting the territorial authorities involved, maybe finding proper homes for the children with married couples who can provide what they need." Rebecca felt ice form in her veins despite the warm spring air. She'd heard the whispers too, the disapproving comments from people who believed that women needed male supervision to function properly in civilized society. Most of the criticism came from town wives who'd never faced real hardship, women whose husbands provided comfortable homes and social standing that insulated them from the harsh realities of frontier survival. "And you think your return would solve that problem?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice level. "I think a man's presence would give folks less reason to complain," Otis replied. "I think our son deserves to carry his father's name with pride instead of shame. I think maybe we could make this work if we tried, if you could find it in your heart to forgive what I done." Before Rebecca could respond, Elizabeth appeared in the doorway with Sally close behind her. The older woman carried herself with the quiet dignity that had sustained her through an abusive marriage and its violent end, but Rebecca could see the worry in her eyes. They'd both known this day might come, had discussed what they'd do if Otis returned to claim his rights as husband and father. "Mrs. Patterson," Otis said, nodding respectfully, "I want to thank you for taking care of my wife and son when I couldn't be here to do it myself." Elizabeth's smile held no warmth. "Your wife took care of herself and your son, Mr. Thornton. I just provided a roof over their heads while she figured out how to build a life worth living." The rebuke hung in the air between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Otis had the grace to look ashamed, but Rebecca could see him struggling to maintain the genial facade he'd always used to smooth over difficult conversations. "I know I got no right to ask for forgiveness," he said, addressing both women but focusing primarily on Rebecca. "I know what I done was wrong, leaving you alone in that storm, taking money that didn't belong to me, staying away so long without word. But I'm here now, ready to take responsibility for my family and make things right." Sally moved closer to Rebecca, slipping her small hand into the older woman's calloused palm. The gesture spoke volumes about the bonds that had formed during Otis's absence, relationships built on daily trust rather than legal obligations or romantic promises. "Things are already right," Rebecca said quietly. "We've built something good here, something that works for all of us. I won't let you destroy that with your notion of what a family should look like." Otis's expression hardened slightly, the first crack in his carefully maintained composure. "I'm still your husband, Rebecca. Still the boy's father. That means something in the eyes of the law, even if you've decided it don't matter to you anymore." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. He could claim his legal rights, force her to choose between her independence and her child's legitimacy. In a territory where women had few legal protections and fewer economic opportunities, a man's claim to his wife and children carried considerable weight with authorities who believed in maintaining proper social order. Elizabeth stepped forward, her own experience with male authority making her sensitive to the dynamics at play. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside, where the children can't hear every word. This is a family matter that deserves privacy." As they moved into the house, Rebecca caught sight of another rider approaching along the road. This one she recognized immediately, Sheriff Clay Morrison, Samuel's younger brother and one of the few lawmen in the territory who'd earned respect through competence rather than political connections. His presence couldn't be coincidental, not with Otis's return happening on the same day. The sheriff dismounted and approached the house with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned to read situations before committing himself to any particular course of action. He was younger than his merchant brother, probably not yet 30, but frontier life had given him the kind of steady confidence that came from facing real danger and surviving it. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, touching his hat brim politely. "Mr. Thornton." Heard you might be back in the area. Otis stiffened visibly. Sheriff Morrison. I suppose your brother sent word about my return. Samuel mentioned you'd settled your accounts with him before leaving town last winter, Clay replied carefully. Said you'd paid in full, even added a bit extra for the inconvenience of conducting business during a storm. Rebecca looked sharply at Otis, confusion replacing some of her anger. That wasn't the story Morrison had told her, wasn't the reason she'd been working to repay money her husband had supposedly stolen. Your brother told me a different story, she said, directing her words to the sheriff but watching Otis's face for his reaction. He said Otis had taken money that didn't belong to him, money intended for spring seed purchases. Clay Morrison's expression grew carefully neutral, the look of a man who'd walked into the middle of a complicated situation and needed to understand all the pieces before taking action. Perhaps we should all sit down and sort out exactly what happened last winter. Seems like there might be some confusion about the facts. Elizabeth bustled around the kitchen, preparing coffee with movements that spoke of nervous energy needing an outlet. Sally had disappeared into the back room with baby James, following instructions to keep the children occupied while the adults talked. The little girl had developed an uncanny ability to sense when conversations were heading toward territory that might threaten the stability of their makeshift family. Otis took a seat at the rough pine table he'd built during their first year of marriage, his hands clasped in front of him like a penitent preparing for confession. I reckon I owe everyone an explanation for what happened and why I stayed away so long. Start with the money, Clay said, settling into the chair across from him. My brother's been telling folks you took funds that belonged to his business, but just now he told me you'd paid your debts in full. Can't both stories be true? Otis looked around the table, his gaze lingering on Rebecca's face before he began to speak. Samuel's been running 2 sets of books for years, taking grain from farmers at prices below what he reports to his eastern buyers. The difference goes into his own pocket, money that should rightfully belong to the men who grew the crops he's selling. The accusation hung heavy in the air. If true, it meant Samuel Morrison had been systematically cheating every farmer in the territory, using his position as the only grain buyer within 50 miles to enrich himself at their expense. That's a serious charge, Clay said slowly. You got proof of these claims? Otis reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded paper, smoothing it carefully on the table. This here's a letter from a grain broker in Chicago, confirming prices Samuel's been getting for territorial wheat. Compare those numbers to what he's been paying farmers, and you'll see the truth quick enough. Rebecca leaned forward to examine the document, her ability to read putting her ahead of most frontier wives in understanding its implications. The figures were damning. Morrison had been paying farmers roughly half the actual market value for their grain, pocketing the difference while claiming to operate on thin margins that barely allowed him to stay in business. So you took what you believed he owed you, Clay said, his tone carefully neutral. I took what was rightfully mine and every other farmer who'd been cheated, Otis confirmed. Called it collecting a debt long overdue. Samuel knew exactly what I was doing and why. Knew I had him dead to rights on the fraud he'd been running. Elizabeth set coffee cups around the table with hands that trembled slightly. The revelation cast Samuel Morrison's earlier kindness to Rebecca in a different light. Not generosity born of sympathy, but guilt over lies that had caused unnecessary hardship. Then why did he tell Rebecca you'd stolen from him? She asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. Otis's expression grew pained. Because I asked him to. Because I was too ashamed to tell my wife the truth about why I couldn't come home. Rebecca felt the foundation of her understanding shift beneath her like loose ground in an earthquake. What truth, Otis? What could be worse than theft that would make you prefer to be thought a criminal? The truth that I'm a coward, Otis said quietly. The truth that when I finally had money in my pocket and the means to provide for my family, I lost it all trying to prove I was smarter than I am. The truth that I was too proud to come home empty-handed and too weak to stay away forever. The confession settled over the room like dust after a windstorm. Rebecca stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since they'd married. Not the romantic hero she'd fallen in love with, not the villain she'd come to hate, but a flawed man who'd made terrible choices and lacked the courage to face their consequences honestly. "You let me believe you were dead," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You let me grieve for you while you were alive and gambling away money that could have fed our son." "I know," Otis replied, tears gathering in his eyes. "I know how wrong it was, how much pain I caused. But I kept thinking I could win it back, that I could return with enough money to make up for everything. By the time I realized I was just making things worse, I didn't know how to fix what I'd broken." Clay Morrison cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the legal implications of the situation. "Seems to me the first thing we need to do is get this straightened out with my brother. If he's been defrauding farmers, that's a crime that needs addressing. And if he's been lying about Mr. Thornton's actions, that needs correcting too." Rebecca looked around the table at the faces of people whose lives had been shaped by Samuel Morrison's lies and Otis's pride. Elizabeth had taken her in based on false information about her husband's crimes. She'd worked for months to repay money that had never actually been stolen. Most importantly, she'd built a new life on the assumption that her old one was truly dead and buried. "What do you want from me, Otis?" she asked finally. "You've explained what happened, but you haven't said what you're hoping will happen now." Otis reached across the table as if to take her hand, then stopped when she didn't move to meet him halfway. "I want to come home. I want to be the husband and father I should have been from the beginning. I want to rebuild what we had and make it stronger than before." "And if I don't want that?" Rebecca asked, surprised by her own boldness. "If I found something better than what we had, something that works without needing you to make it complete?" The question caught Otis off guard. In all his planning for this confrontation, he'd apparently never considered that his wife might prefer her new life to the old one he wanted to restore. "I suppose that would be your right," he said slowly. "But I'd ask you to think about what's best for our son, what kind of life you can give him without a father's guidance and protection." The threat was gentle but real. Single mothers had few rights and fewer opportunities in frontier society. Courts would almost always favor a father's claim over a mother's desires, especially when questions of moral propriety had been raised by community gossip. Elizabeth spoke for the first time since the conversation had turned serious. "Seems to me the boy's been getting along fine with the guidance he's been receiving. Growing strong and healthy, learning to talk, developing the kind of temperament that speaks well of his upbringing." "I'm not saying you ladies haven't done a fine job," Otis replied carefully. "But a boy needs to learn things only a father can teach, needs to see how a man handles responsibility and provides for his family." Rebecca felt anger flare again, hot and bright in her chest. "Like you handled responsibility when you left us to face winter alone? Like you provided for us by gambling away money that could have secured our future?" "I made mistakes," Otis admitted. "But I'm here now, ready to do better. Ready to be the man my family needs me to be." For how long? Rebecca asked. Until the next time things get difficult and your pride won't let you face the consequences of your choices? Until another opportunity comes along that looks easier than the hard work of building a life day by day. The questions hung between them like a challenge Otis wasn't sure he could meet. He'd come prepared to ask for forgiveness, but not to prove he'd truly changed or earned the right to a second chance. Clay Morrison stood up from the table, his coffee barely touched. I think this is a conversation that needs to continue without me present. But I'll be stopping by to talk with my brother about these allegations, and I expect he'll want to make some corrections to the story he's been telling around town. As the sheriff prepared to leave, Rebecca found herself facing a choice she'd never expected to have to make. Otis was offering to resume their marriage, to provide the social respectability and male protection that frontier society demanded. But accepting his offer would mean giving up the independence and partnership she'd found with Elizabeth, abandoning a life built on mutual support for one founded on dependence and forgiveness. The baby's cry from the back room interrupted her thoughts, reminding her that her decisions affected more than just herself. James needed consideration, and so did Sally, whose legal status remained precarious despite the adoption papers. Elizabeth deserved to know whether their partnership would continue or dissolve based on Otis's return. As Clay Morrison rode away and Otis waited for her answer, Rebecca realized that the woman who'd sat alone in a cabin during that terrible blizzard no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who'd learned to value reality over romance and partnership over passion. The question now was whether Otis Thornton could accept this new version of his wife, or whether he'd try to force her back into the shape of the woman he'd abandoned 6 months ago. The summer heat had settled over the territory like a heavy quilt, bringing with it the kind of oppressive stillness that made even the strongest men seek shade during the middle hours of the day. Rebecca stood in the kitchen of what everyone now called the Patterson Thornton place, her hands working automatically to knead bread dough while her mind wrestled with the decision that had been hanging over her household for 3 weeks since Otis's return. Through the open window, she could hear voices from the front yard where her husband sat with Sheriff Clay Morrison and Doc Henley, discussing the community meeting that had been called for this very evening. Otis had been living in the barn since his return, sleeping on a makeshift bed Elizabeth had helped Rebecca arrange among the farm tools and stored grain. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed them all to maintain some semblance of dignity while the larger questions of their future remained unresolved. He took his meals with the family, helped with the heavier chores that had been Elizabeth's burden during his absence, and spent hours each day trying to win back the trust of a son who regarded him with the curious detachment children reserved for interesting strangers. The arrangement had given Rebecca time to observe the man her husband had become during his months of exile. Otis worked hard without complaint, rose early to milk their cow and tend the animals, and spent his evenings carving toys for both James and Sally with the patient skill she remembered from their early days together. But something fundamental had changed in him, a quality of desperate eagerness that reminded her of a dog that had been beaten and now flinched at every raised voice. He watched her constantly for signs of softening, analyzed every word she spoke for hints about her intentions, and grew visibly anxious whenever the conversation turned to their future arrangements. Elizabeth entered the kitchen carrying a basket of eggs from their expanded chicken coop, her movements economical and purposeful as always. The two women had developed an easy partnership over the months, sharing domestic duties and child-rearing responsibilities in ways that felt natural rather than forced. They rarely needed to discuss who would handle which tasks. Elizabeth gravitated toward the animals and outdoor work that reminded her of happier times in her childhood, while Rebecca preferred the indoor work of cooking, cleaning, and mending that allowed her to keep one eye on the children. Morrison's brought news from town, Elizabeth said. setting the eggs on the counter with careful precision. Seems his brother Samuel has decided to take an extended trip back east, something about visiting family and exploring new business opportunities. Rebecca understood the euphemism. Samuel Morrison was fleeing before the full extent of his fraudulent dealings became public knowledge, taking whatever money he could carry and leaving his brother to clean up the mess he'd created. It was probably the wisest course of action from his perspective, but it left the farmers he'd cheated with little hope of recovering their losses. "What about the money he owes?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Clay says the business accounts are near empty, just enough left to settle current debts to the Eastern grain brokers. Whatever Samuel skimmed off over the years, he's taken with him or hidden where it can't be found." The news shouldn't have surprised Rebecca, but it still left her feeling hollow with disappointment. She'd been working to repay a debt that had never existed, but knowing that truth didn't restore the money Otis had actually lost to gambling or make their financial situation any more secure. Sally appeared in the doorway, her sun-browned face serious with the weight of whatever message she'd been sent to deliver. At 5 years old, she'd become the unofficial messenger between the adults and the outside world, her small size and quick intelligence making her perfect for such duties. "Mama Rebecca," she said, using the title that had evolved naturally during their months together, "Papa Otis wants to know if you'll come outside. Sheriff Morrison has something important to tell everyone." Rebecca wiped flour from her hands and followed the child into the yard, where the three men sat in whatever shade they could find beneath the old elm tree. Otis rose when she approached, a gesture of courtesy that seemed to come from habit rather than genuine respect. She noticed he'd taken to calling her Mrs. Thornton when others were present, as if the formal address might somehow restore the authority their marriage had once granted him. Clay Morrison stood as well, his hat in his hands, and his expression serious enough to suggest the news he carried was weightier than simple gossip about his brother's departure. "Ma'am, I wanted to speak with you and Mr. Thornton together about something that's come to my attention. Something that affects your family directly." Rebecca felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. In her experience, official visits from lawmen rarely brought good news, especially for women whose circumstances didn't fit conventional expectations. "There's been talk in town," Morrison continued, his voice carefully neutral, "about the arrangement you folks have here. Some people are saying it ain't proper for children to be raised in a household where the adults ain't legally married to each other." The accusation hung in the hot air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Rebecca had been expecting something like this ever since Otis's return had made their unusual living situation more visible to community scrutiny. Frontier society might tolerate a woman raising children alone out of necessity, but it looked with deep suspicion on choices that seemed to reject traditional family structures. "Who's been talking?" Otis asked, his voice carrying an edge that suggested he was prepared to defend his family's honor with more than words if necessary. "Mrs. Abernathy and some of the other church ladies," Morrison replied reluctantly. "They filed a formal complaint with the territorial authorities, claiming that both children would be better served in homes with proper married couples who could provide appropriate moral guidance." Elizabeth had followed them outside and now stood in the doorway, her face pale with understanding. As an unmarried woman with no legal claim to any of the children, she was the most vulnerable member of their household to official interference. If the authorities decided their arrangement was improper, she could lose everything she'd helped build over the past months. Doc Henley, who'd remained silent during the sheriff's announcement, finally spoke up. "Rebecca, I've been thinking about this situation, and I believe there might be a solution that would satisfy everyone's concerns." All eyes turned to the elderly physician, whose opinion carried considerable weight in community discussions. He'd delivered baby James, tended Elizabeth through her husband's final illness, and provided medical care to half the families in the territory. If he had a suggestion, people would listen. The way I see it, Doc continued, you've got a household here that's working well for everyone involved. 2 women sharing the load of domestic work and child-rearing, a man providing protection and handling the heavier labor, children who are healthy and well cared for. The only problem is that it don't fit the pattern folks expect to see. Rebecca waited for him to continue, sensing that he was building toward a proposal that would require careful consideration. Now, I ain't suggesting anyone should do anything against their conscience, Doc said, looking directly at Rebecca, but it seems to me that if certain legal arrangements were formalized, it might quiet the talk and give everyone more security. Otis stepped forward eagerly. Doc's right, Rebecca. If we were to remarry in a proper ceremony, with witnesses and legal documentation, it would give our son legitimacy and put an end to the gossip about our living situation. Rebecca felt the familiar anger rise in her chest. Remarry? We're still married, Otis, at least according to the law. What you're talking about is me agreeing to honor vows you broke when you abandoned us. I know I broke faith with you, Otis replied, his voice carrying the rehearsed quality of a man who'd practiced this speech. But I'm here now, ready to make amends and be the husband you deserve. We could start fresh, build something better than what we had before. Elizabeth moved to stand beside Rebecca, a gesture of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by any of the men present. And what about Sally? What happens to her if Rebecca decides to reconcile with her husband? The question highlighted the complexity of their situation. Sally's adoption into Rebecca's care was legal but precarious, dependent on Rebecca's status as a stable, responsible guardian. If Rebecca chose to rebuild her marriage with Otis, his rights as her husband would give him considerable say in household decisions, including what happened to a child he'd had no role in raising. The girl would be welcome in our family, Otis said quickly. I've got no objection to raising her alongside our own son. She's a good child, well-behaved and helpful. But Rebecca heard the slight hesitation in his voice, the way he referred to Sally as the girl, rather than using her name. She understood that his acceptance was conditional, a concession offered to sweeten his proposal rather than a genuine desire to embrace the child as his own daughter. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the official nature of his visit. I need to be clear about what's at stake here. Mrs. Abernathy and her supporters have petitioned the territorial court to review the children's living situations. If the judge decides this household doesn't provide proper moral guidance, both children could be removed and placed with families deemed more suitable. The threat was real and immediate. Rebecca had heard stories of children taken from their mothers by officials who believed they knew better than the women who'd raised them. In a territory where women had few legal rights and judges were often influenced by the loudest voices in the community, such interventions were entirely possible. How long do we have? Elizabeth asked, her voice steady despite the fear Rebecca could see in her eyes. The hearing's been scheduled for the end of next month, Morrison replied. That gives you folks about 6 weeks to decide how you want to handle this situation. As the sheriff prepared to leave, Doc Henley lingered behind, clearly wanting to speak privately with the family. When Morrison's horse had disappeared down the road toward town, the elderly physician turned back to face the small group that remained. Rebecca, I've known you since you first arrived in this territory, he said gently. I've watched you grow from a young wife with romantic notions into a woman who knows how to survive and thrive under difficult circumstances. I delivered your son and saw how you handled that trial without your husband's support. I have nothing but respect for what you've accomplished here." Rebecca waited for the qualification she sensed was coming. "But I also know this territory and the people in it," Doc continued. "I know that judges and officials don't always make decisions based on what's best for children. Sometimes they're more concerned with maintaining social order and satisfying the voters who put them in office." Otis moved closer to Rebecca, not quite touching her but clearly hoping to present a united front. "Doc's right. We need to think about what's practical, not just what's fair or what we might prefer under different circumstances." Elizabeth spoke for the first time since Morrison's departure. "And what about what I've built here? What about the fact that this partnership has worked better than either of our marriages ever did?" The question hung between them like a challenge none of the men seemed prepared to address directly. In their calculations of practical solutions and social acceptability, they'd given little thought to what Elizabeth might lose if Rebecca chose to prioritize her legal marriage over their chosen partnership. Sally appeared at Rebecca's side, slipping her small hand into the woman's calloused palm with the unconscious trust that had developed between them over months of shared daily life. The gesture reminded everyone present that the stakes of this decision extended far beyond adult pride or convenience. "I need time to think," Rebecca said finally. "This isn't a choice I can make quickly or without considering all the consequences." Otis looked disappointed but nodded his acceptance. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Just remember that our son deserves a father's name and protection, and you deserve a husband who's learned from his mistakes." As the group began to disperse, Doc Henley touched Rebecca's arm gently. "There might be another option," he said quietly. "Something that could protect all of you without requiring anyone to sacrifice what they've built here." Rebecca looked at him with interest, desperate for alternatives to the impossible choice she seemed to be facing. "Marriage ain't the only way to create legal family connections," Doc explained. "There are other arrangements, business partnerships and formal guardianships that could give everyone more security without disrupting what you've established." The suggestion was intriguing but vague, requiring more discussion and careful planning than they could manage in a single conversation. Rebecca found herself grateful for any possibility that didn't force her to choose between the life she'd built and the social acceptance her children needed. That evening, after Otis had retired to the barn and the children were asleep in their beds, Rebecca and Elizabeth sat on the front porch sharing the kind of comfortable silence that had become routine between them. The summer air was finally beginning to cool, and fireflies blinked among the tall grass like tiny lanterns celebrating the end of another day. "I won't hold you to any promises you made when you thought you were a widow," Elizabeth said eventually. "If you decide Otis is offering something better than what we have here, I'll understand and support your choice." Rebecca rocked slowly in the chair Otis had made, considering her friend's words and the generosity behind them. "And if I choose to stay as we are? If I decide that what we've built is worth fighting for?" "Then we'll fight," Elizabeth replied simply. "Together, like we've done everything else." The promise settled between them like a benediction, a reminder that some bonds were stronger than law or social convention. Whatever challenges the coming weeks might bring, Rebecca knew she wouldn't face them alone. 3 weeks later, the entire community gathered in Millfield's small schoolhouse for what everyone understood would be a decisive meeting about the future of the Patterson-Thornton household. The territorial judge had arrived that morning, a stern-faced man whose reputation for strict adherence to conventional morality had preceded him from the territorial capital. Mrs. Abernathy and her supporters occupied the front rows, their expressions radiating the satisfaction of people convinced they were doing God's work by protecting innocent children from corrupting influences. Rebecca sat between Elizabeth and Otis, Sally on her lap and baby James sleeping peacefully in his father's arms. The image of domestic harmony was carefully constructed but not entirely false. They had learned to function as a family unit, even if the relationships between the adults remained complicated and unresolved. Doc Henley stood to address the assembly, his age and respected position giving his words considerable weight with everyone present. Your Honor, before we begin discussing the children's welfare, I think it's important for everyone to understand exactly what kind of household we're talking about. He gestured toward Rebecca and her family. These children are healthy, well-fed, properly clothed, and receiving education in reading, writing, and practical skills they'll need as adults. Young Sally has gained 15 pounds since joining this household and shows none of the fearful behavior that marked her when she first arrived. Baby James is developing normally and shows every sign of thriving under his current care. Mrs. Abernathy rose to her feet, her voice sharp with righteous indignation. Doctor, no one questions whether the children are physically healthy. The concern is for their moral development in a household that doesn't follow Christian principles of marriage and family structure. And what Christian principles are those, exactly? Doc asked mildly. The ones that say we should care for orphans and widows? The ones that command us to judge not lest we be judged? Or maybe the ones that tell us to love our neighbors as ourselves? The challenge drew murmurs from the assembled crowd. Doc Henley might be old, but his knowledge of Scripture was extensive and his reputation for moral behavior was unassailable. Sheriff Morrison stood next, carrying a folder of documents that represented weeks of investigation. Your Honor, I've been looking into the circumstances that led to this complaint, and I believe there are some facts the court should consider. He opened the folder and withdrew several papers. First, regarding the allegations that Mr. Thornton abandoned his family, I have evidence that he was defrauded by a local businessman who has since fled the territory to avoid prosecution. Second, regarding Mrs. Patterson's fitness as a guardian, I have testimonies from a dozen neighbors attesting to her character and the quality of care she's provided. The sheriff's support carried considerable weight with the judge, who understood the importance of maintaining good relationships with local law enforcement in frontier territories. Otis stood slowly, baby James still cradled in his arms. Your Honor, I want to address the court about my family's situation. Rebecca tensed, uncertain what her husband intended to say. They'd discussed strategy briefly, but Otis had a tendency toward grand gestures that didn't always align with practical considerations. I made serious mistakes last winter, Otis continued. I left my pregnant wife alone during a blizzard, and I stayed away longer than I should have while trying to repair the damage those mistakes had caused. But I want this court to understand something important. My wife didn't just survive my absence, she thrived. He gestured toward Rebecca with obvious pride. She built a partnership with Mrs. Patterson that has benefited everyone involved. She provided a home for an orphan child who needed protection. She gave birth to our son and raised him to be healthy and strong. She did all of this while working to support herself and contributing to her community. Rebecca felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened to Otis acknowledge her strength, rather than simply asking for forgiveness for his weakness. Now, Otis continued, I could ask this court to restore my legal authority over my wife and children, to force them back into a traditional arrangement that might satisfy social expectations. But I won't do that, because I've learned something important during my time away. He paused, looking directly at Rebecca. "I learned that a man's worth isn't measured by his ability to control his family, but by his willingness to support them in whatever arrangements work best for everyone involved." The declaration sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled crowd. Mrs. Abernathy looked scandalized, while Doc Henley smiled with obvious satisfaction. Elizabeth rose to her feet, her voice carrying clearly through the schoolhouse. "Your Honor, I want to propose a formal arrangement that might address everyone's concerns while protecting the children's welfare." She withdrew a document from her reticule, papers that had been carefully prepared with Doc Henley's guidance over the previous weeks. "This is a formal business partnership agreement between myself, Rebecca Thornton, and Otis Thornton, establishing joint ownership of our property and shared responsibility for all children in our care." The judge accepted the document and began reading, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful as he absorbed its contents. "The arrangement provides legal protection for all parties," Elizabeth continued, "while maintaining the successful household structure that has proven beneficial for everyone involved, especially the children." Mrs. Abernathy stood again, her voice shrill with outrage. "This is exactly the kind of unconventional arrangement that threatens the moral fabric of our community. Children need proper families, not business partnerships masquerading as households." Doc Henley rose to respond, his voice carrying the authority of age and experience. "Mrs. Abernathy, with respect, I've seen more families destroyed by rigid adherence to convention than I've ever seen helped by it. These children are thriving under the current arrangement. Sometimes the most Christian thing we can do is recognize God's work when we see it, even if it doesn't look exactly like what we expected." The judge looked around the room, taking in the faces of community members who would have to live with whatever decision he made. "This court's primary concern is the welfare of the children involved. Based on the evidence presented, including medical testimony about their health and development, witness statements about their care, and the formal legal arrangements proposed by their guardians, I see no reason to disrupt their current living situation." Mrs. Abernathy's supporters looked deflated, while relief spread across the faces of Rebecca's defenders. "However," the judge continued, "I will require quarterly reports on the children's welfare and reserve the right to review this arrangement if circumstances change significantly." As the crowd began to disperse, Rebecca found herself surrounded by neighbors offering congratulations and support. The battle had been won, but she understood that the war for social acceptance would continue. Some people would never approve of their unconventional family structure, but enough had been convinced of its value to provide the community support they needed. Otis approached her as the schoolhouse emptied, his expression hopeful but uncertain. "Rebecca, I want you to know that I meant what I said in there. I'm not asking you to be the wife you were before I left. I'm asking if there's room in the life you've built for the man I'm trying to become." Rebecca looked at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since they'd married. Not the romantic hero she'd fallen in love with, not the villain she'd learned to hate, but a flawed human being who was genuinely trying to change and grow. "There's room," she said finally. "But it has to be on terms that work for all of us, not just the ones that make you comfortable." Otis nodded, understanding that his place in this family would be earned through daily actions rather than legal rights or romantic gestures. As autumn approached and the leaves began to turn, the Patterson-Thornton household settled into new rhythms that honored both tradition and innovation. Otis worked the land with skill and dedication, but important decisions were made jointly by all three adults. Rebecca continued her partnership with Elizabeth, sharing domestic duties and child-rearing responsibilities in ways that utilized each woman's strengths. Sally and James grew together as siblings, their bond strengthened by the security of knowing they belonged to a family that had chosen them deliberately rather than accepting them out of obligation. The arrangement wasn't perfect, no family ever was, but it worked because all its members had learned to value reality over romance, partnership over dominance, and chosen love over social convention. When neighbors asked how they made it work, Rebecca would smile and say they'd learned that families came in many forms, but the best ones were built on daily acts of love, support, and mutual respect. And on winter evenings when the wind howled around their comfortable home, Rebecca would remember that terrible blizzard that had once threatened to destroy everything she held dear, and she'd give thanks for the strength that had carried her through to this moment when her children were safe, her household was secure, and her future stretched ahead full of possibilities she'd never dared to imagine during those dark and desperate days when she'd faced the wilderness alone.